I said only insecure men want monogamy. Now he's sleeping with someone else and I can't even be mad. Okay, so this is absolutely wild and I'm still trying to process everything that happened. Like, I literally can't even be mad because this is technically what I asked for. I'm Macy, 32, and I've spent the last 5 years of my life confidently telling everyone, especially my husband, that monogamy is for the birds. Or more specifically, for insecure men who can't handle their partners having freedom. And now? Well, let's just say the universe decided to call my bluff in the most brutal way possible. I met Vince at Bookmark Cafe, where I work as a barista while trying to finish my novel. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork, always ordering the same thing, an Americano with room for cream. I noticed him right away because, unlike most customers who barely looked up from their phones, he actually made eye contact and said thank you. Plus, he was gorgeous in this understated way, tall with these deep brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled. After 2 weeks of him coming in, I finally wrote my number on his cup with a stupid little note. We went out that weekend, and it was like we'd known each other forever. He worked at this financial advisory firm downtown. Nothing flashy, just steady. He listened when I talked about my writing and actually asked questions about my characters, like they were real people. We dated for 2 years before getting married in a small ceremony at his parents' lake house. Even back then, I was vocal about my views on relationships. I'd gone through this feminist awakening in college and had all these big ideas about how traditional marriage was this patriarchal trap. I'd read all these books about ethical non-monogamy and relationship anarchy, and I truly believed that jealousy was just insecurity in disguise. I'd tell Vince and anyone who would listen that only insecure men want monogamy, and real love means wanting your partner to experience everything life has to offer. Looking back, I can see how Vince would get this little crease between his eyebrows whenever I'd go on one of my rants. But he never argued with me. He'd just nod and say something like, "That's an interesting perspective, Mace." I took his silence as agreement, or at least as him coming around to my obviously more evolved way of thinking. We moved into this cute little apartment in Oakwood Heights after the wedding. Nothing special. Just a one-bedroom with terrible water pressure and neighbors who fought at 3 a.m., but it was ours. We each kept our separate friend groups. Mine, mostly from the cafe and my writing workshops, his from work and his weekly basketball game. We had our own hobbies and interests, which I thought was so healthy. My friends thought we were the perfect couple. Bree would always say, "God, you guys have it figured out. Tyler won't even let me go to the store without calling to check in." And I'd smile this smug little smile, feeling so evolved and enlightened. I truly believed Vince and I had cracked the code to a happy marriage. Independence, with just enough togetherness. For 3 years, everything seemed perfect. I kept working at the cafe, picking up extra shifts to save for a writing retreat. Vince got a small promotion at work. We took weekend trips to the coast, binged shows together, and had inside jokes that made us laugh until we couldn't breathe. But underneath it all, I was starting to feel restless, like there was more out there I was missing out on. If I'd been paying attention, I might have noticed that Vince was happy with exactly what we had. He didn't seem restless or confined. He seemed content. But I was too busy theorizing about relationships to actually see the one I was in. And that blindness, that absolute confidence in my own enlightened views, was about to blow up everything we had built together. It all started at Shannon's housewarming party. She'd finally moved out of her parents' place and invited basically everyone she knew to come see the tiny studio apartment she was so proud of. I was grabbing another drink when I spotted him, Julian. We'd had a few classes together in college but hadn't really kept in touch. He'd gotten even better looking, with this new confidence that made my stomach do this weird flippy thing. "Macy Turner? No way." He pulled me into a hug that lasted just a second too long. "How the heck have you been? Are you still writing that sci-fi novel?" The fact that he remembered my writing knocked me sideways. We ended up talking in the corner for over an hour, completely ignoring everyone else. Julian was working as a graphic designer now, freelancing for all these cool indie brands. Nothing happened. No kissing, not even hand-holding, but there was this electricity that I hadn't felt in Well, since early days with Vince. The texting started the next day. Just casual stuff at first, links to articles about writing, funny memes about caffeine addiction. But it quickly became a daily thing. We started meeting for coffee during my breaks. Again, nothing physical happened, but there was this undeniable spark, this what-if hovering between us. And that's when the idea really took root. Why shouldn't I explore this connection? Monogamy was a social construct, right? I'd been saying this for years. Maybe it was time to practice what I preached. The hard part was figuring out how to bring it up with Vince. I waited for the perfect moment. A Saturday morning when we were both relaxed, coffee in hand, sun streaming through our kitchen window. "Babe, I've been thinking about something," I started, trying to sound casual. "You know my views on relationships, and how I think monogamy is kind of an outdated concept." Vince lowered his coffee mug, that familiar crease appearing between his eyebrows. "What's this about, Mace?" "Well, I've been reading more about ethical non-monogamy, and it makes so much sense. People aren't meant to get everything from just one person." His face changed in this subtle way, a slight tightening around the eyes. "Are you attracted to someone else?" I waved my hand dismissively. "That's not what this is about. It's about freedom and honesty. Don't you think there's something beautiful about loving someone enough to let them be completely free?" I didn't mention Julian. Not yet. "I thought we were happy," he said quietly. "We are. This isn't about happiness. It's about growth, about not limiting each other." I leaned forward, taking his hand. "Only insecure men want monogamy, Vince. You're not insecure, are you?" That was a low blow, and I knew it even as the words left my mouth. Vince pulled his hand away, standing up to take his mug to the sink. His back to me, shoulders tense. "I need to think about this." Over the next few weeks, I continued my campaign. I left articles about polyamory on the coffee table. I brought it up casually in conversations, all while texting Julian more frequently, meeting him for longer coffee dates where our knees would touch under the table. Vince grew quieter, more withdrawn. But I was so focused on what I wanted that I interpreted his withdrawal as contemplation rather than hurt. I told myself he was processing, evolving. In reality, he was retreating. Finally, after nearly a month of persistent nudging, Vince agreed. We were lying in bed, the room dark except for the streetlight filtering through the blinds. "Okay," he said, voice flat. "If this is what you want, let's try it." "Really?" I propped myself up on one elbow, surprised by the sudden capitulation. "Yeah, you're right. Maybe I am being insecure." The way he said it made my stomach twist, but I pushed the feeling away. "We'll have boundaries, of course," I rushed to add. "Complete honesty. Safe sex. Our relationship comes first." He nodded, eyes on the ceiling. "Whatever you say, Mace." I was too excited to notice the resignation in his voice. All I could think about was texting Julian the next day, telling him the door was open. I fell asleep planning our first real date, while next to me, Vince lay awake until dawn. The arrangement began almost immediately. I didn't waste any time letting Julian know that Vince and I had opened our relationship. His response was enthusiastic, though he did ask several times if Vince was truly okay with it. I assured him everything was above board. We scheduled our first official date for that Friday, dinner at this trendy new restaurant downtown. I spent hours getting ready, trying on different outfits, doing and redoing my makeup. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, Vince was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, and for a brief moment, I saw something flash across his face. Pain, maybe, or resignation. "You look nice," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thanks," I replied, suddenly feeling awkward. "I won't be late. Probably home by 11. He nodded, already looking back at his phone. "Have a good time." That first date with Julian was everything I'd imagined. The conversation flowed easily, the attraction was palpable, and for the first time in years, I felt that fluttery excitement of something new. We ended the night with a kiss that left me breathless, and I floated home on a cloud of validation. When I got home, the apartment was dark. Vince had already gone to bed, or was pretending to be asleep. I quietly got ready for bed and slipped in beside him, a careful distance between our bodies. In the morning, he didn't ask about my date, and I didn't offer any details. It was the first of many silences that would grow between us. Over the next few weeks, I saw Julian regularly. We went from dinner dates to spending entire afternoons together, from kissing to much more, all while Vince became increasingly absent, physically and emotionally. He started working late, hitting the gym more often, keeping his responses to my questions brief and non-committal. But I was too caught up in the novelty of Julian to really notice or care. It wasn't until about a month into this arrangement that I casually mentioned to Vince that he too could see other people if he wanted. I mean, that's the whole point of an open relationship, right? I said, stirring pasta sauce on the stove. You're free too. He looked up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. Right? Thanks for the reminder. Have you thought about it at all? I asked, suddenly curious. About seeing someone else? He shrugged. Not really. Well, the option's there, I said cheerfully, turning back to the stove. I didn't mean it, not really. I liked the idea of Vince waiting at home while I explored. The power dynamic felt good. Me evolving, him standing still. I never seriously considered he might take me up on my offer. That evening, I noticed him texting more than usual, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. A tiny seed of unease planted itself in my stomach, but I dismissed it. Vince wasn't the type to actually see someone else. He was too traditional, too steady, wasn't he? As the weeks turned into months, something shifted. The initial excitement with Julian began to fade. The conversations that once seemed so deep started to feel repetitive. Meanwhile, Vince had changed in subtle ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. He seemed more self-contained. He no longer asked me about my day or seemed interested in my latest writing progress. When I came home from dates with Julian, he didn't seem to care. No subtle shows of jealousy, no questions, nothing. Just a polite nod and a good night before returning to whatever he was doing. At the same time, I noticed other changes. New clothes appearing in his closet, a different cologne, more attention to his appearance in general. He'd always been fit, but now his shoulders seemed broader, his jawline more defined. His phone became a constant companion, often chiming with text messages that made him smile in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in months. It wasn't until I was paying our cell phone bill online one evening that I noticed something odd. There was a number that appeared dozens of times in Vince's call and text logs, far more frequently than any other contact, a number I didn't recognize. The next morning over breakfast, I mentioned the number as casually as I could. Hey, I was paying the phone bill yesterday and noticed you've been texting someone a lot. Number ending in 4382? Vince glanced up from his toast, his expression neutral. Oh, that's Amber. She's helping me with the Henderson account at work. Seems like a lot of texts for work, I said, trying to keep my tone light. He shrugged. She's thorough. We've been putting in extra hours on this one. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. The way he said her name, Amber, with a familiarity that suggested more than just a professional relationship. But what could I say? I was literally spending multiple evenings a week with another man. I had no ground to stand on. But I wasn't just curious, I was uneasy. And that unease grew as I began paying more attention to Vince's behavior. The late nights at work, the weekends when he'd be gone for hours, supposedly at the gym or running errands but returning with no obvious purchases, the way he no longer reached for me in bed. Meanwhile, my relationship with Julian had plateaued. We still saw each other regularly, but the excitement had faded into something comfortable but ultimately unsatisfying. I found myself thinking about Vince more during our dates, wondering what he was doing, who he was with. I suggested a weekend getaway, thinking some alone time might help us reconnect. I can't that weekend, he said, not even looking up from his phone. I've got plans. What plans? I asked, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. Just plans, Mace. Things I need to take care of. It was the vagueness that finally pushed me over the edge. After 3 months of our open relationship, I realized I had no idea what my husband actually did with his time anymore. We lived like polite roommates, sharing space, but not lives. And it was eating me alive. I decided to surprise him at work for lunch, not to catch him in anything. At least that's what I told myself, but just to see him, to reconnect in some small way. I picked up sandwiches from his favorite deli and headed downtown to his office building. But as I approached the entrance, I saw him coming out with a woman. She was stunning in that effortless way, tall and willowy with honey blonde hair and a laugh that carried across the plaza. But what knocked the wind out of me wasn't her appearance, it was the way Vince was looking at her. With warmth and attention and something like adoration. The way he used to look at me. I stood frozen as they walked together to a nearby restaurant, his hand casually resting on the small of her back. Through the window, I watched them sit at a table, leaning toward each other, hands intertwined on the tabletop. And then, as casual as breathing, she leaned forward and kissed him. A quick, familiar gesture that spoke of established intimacy. My vision blurred. The bag of sandwiches suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I turned and walked back to my car in a daze, drove home on autopilot and sat on our couch staring at nothing until I heard his key in the lock hours later. "Hey," he said, surprised to see me home early. "Everything okay?" "Who's Amber?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He paused, his expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. "I told you she's a coworker." "Is that all she is?" A long silence stretched between us. Finally, he sighed and sat down in the armchair across from me. "No," he said simply, "that's not all she is." "How long?" I asked, my throat tight. "A few months, since about a week after you started seeing Julian." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "You've been seeing her this whole time? And you never told me?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in months. "You said you wanted an open relationship. You said only insecure men want monogamy. What was I supposed to do with that, Macy?" "I don't know, maybe talk to me? Tell me you were actually acting on it?" "Why? You never gave me details about Julian." "That's different," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hypocritical they sounded. "How?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "How is it different?" I had no answer. The truth was, I'd wanted the freedom without the consequences. I'd wanted Vince to remain faithfully mine while I explored elsewhere. I'd never genuinely considered what it would mean for him to do the same. "Are you in love with her?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Vince looked down at his hands. "I don't know if it's love yet, but she makes me feel valued, wanted. She doesn't make me feel insecure for wanting a committed relationship." Each word was a knife. Not because they were cruel, Vince wasn't being cruel, but because they were true. I had made him feel insecure, had belittled his desire for monogamy as old-fashioned and regressive. And now someone else was affirming the very things I had dismissed. "So what happens now?" I asked, tears finally spilling over. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I can't keep living like this, Mace, pretending I'm okay with an arrangement I never really wanted." We talked long into the night, really talked for the first time in months. Vince admitted he'd only agreed to open our relationship because he felt cornered, like he had to choose between being insecure or losing me. I admitted that my desire for an open relationship had been less about philosophical beliefs and more about wanting novelty without consequences. But some truths, once spoken, can't be taken back. Some changes, once made, can't be undone. In the weeks that followed, we tried to find our way back to each other. I ended things with Julian. Vince promised to be more open about his feelings. We went to therapy, both together and separately. But the distance remained. Vince continued seeing Amber, though now with my knowledge. He would come home from dates with her with a lightness I couldn't remember seeing in him for years. Meanwhile, I found myself alone with my thoughts, confronting uncomfortable truths about who I was and what I really wanted. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening, nearly 6 months after our relationship had opened. Vince sat down across from me at our kitchen table, his expression serious but calm. "Macy, I need to tell you something," he began. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I've realized something important. I want monogamy. I've always wanted it. Not because I'm insecure, but because that's how I'm built. That's what makes me feel safe and connected." I nodded, tears already threatening. "And Amber wants that too." "Yes," he said quietly, "she does. And I'm the one who doesn't," I finished, the irony not lost on me. He reached across the table to take my hand. "I think maybe you do want it, Mace, but you've spent so long convincing yourself otherwise that you can't admit it." I pulled my hand away, suddenly angry. "Don't tell me what I want." "Okay," he said, leaning back. "Then tell me, what do you want?" The question hung between us, deceptively simple, yet impossible to answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know anymore. I'd spent years building this identity as the progressive, evolved partner who was beyond jealousy and possessiveness. But when faced with the reality of Vince connecting deeply with someone else, all my enlightened theories had crumbled. "I want things to go back to how they were," I finally said, my voice small. Vince's expression was gentle, but resolute. "We can't go back, Macy. Too much has changed. I've changed." A week later, he packed a suitcase. "Just the essentials," he said. He needed space to figure things out. We both knew what that meant, even if neither of us said it out loud. He was moving in with Amber, at least temporarily, testing the waters of a relationship built on shared values rather than theoretical ideals. As I watched him pack, a bitter realization settled over me. I couldn't even be mad at him. Not really. This was exactly what I had advocated for: freedom to follow your heart, to pursue connections without the constraints of traditional monogamy. Vince was simply taking the philosophy I'd preached and living it to its logical conclusion. He paused at the door, suitcase in hand. "I do love you, Macy. I always will. But love isn't enough if we want fundamentally different things." "Do we?" I asked, desperately clinging to the possibility that this was all a misunderstanding. "Want different things?" He gave me a sad smile. "I think we might have wanted the same things all along. We just couldn't admit it to ourselves or each other." After he left, I sat alone in our apartment, my apartment now, I supposed, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. How had my confident theories about relationships led me here, alone and heartbroken? How had I failed to see that what I really wanted wasn't freedom from commitment, but rather the security of knowing Vince was committed to me while I explored elsewhere? The truth was humbling. For all my talk about evolved relationships and freedom from jealousy, I was just as possessive, just as traditional in my desires as anyone else. I'd wanted to keep Vince safely wrapped up in our marriage while I experienced the thrill of something new. When he'd done exactly the same, it had broken me. I couldn't even be mad at him. That was the worst part. He'd simply taken me at my word, followed the path I'd insisted was enlightened. And in doing so, he'd found someone who valued what he had to offer: his loyalty, his desire for monogamy, his traditional heart. As I scrolled through old photos on my phone, pictures of Vince and me in happier times, I wondered how I'd gotten it so wrong. How I'd mistaken his quietness for agreement, his patience for evolution. How I'd been so convinced of my own rightness that I couldn't see the harm I was causing. One photo made me pause, us on our wedding day, my mascara-smeared face beaming up at him, his eyes crinkled with that special smile he reserved just for me. We'd been so happy then, so certain. Before I decided that certainty was boring, that happiness needed enhancement. I set the phone down and wiped my eyes. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty. I thought about texting Julian, but knew that would only be running from the truth again. Instead, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not my novel, but the story of us. Of how I'd been so focused on what I thought I should want that I'd destroyed what I actually had. Maybe someday Vince would read it. Maybe someday we'd find our way back to each other, older and wiser. Or maybe not. Maybe some lessons come too late, and the price of learning them is losing what mattered most. All I knew for certain was that I couldn't even be mad. Not at Vince, not at Amber, not at anyone but myself. I'd said only insecure men want monogamy. Turns out what I really meant was that only insecure women need to test their partner's love by seeing how much freedom they'll tolerate. And in the process of discovering that truth, I'd lost the one person who'd loved me enough to let me learn it my way, even when it meant losing him.